The morning mist clung to the valley floor like ghostly fingers when Sarah Morningstar received word that would change her life forever. At 18, with long black hair that caught sunlight like water and eyes the color of deep forest pools, she had expected to marry within her own tribe. The Modoc people had their traditions, their ways of bringing young couples together through careful family negotiations and seasonal gatherings. But this was different. This was unprecedented. Chief Running Bear sat across from her in the family lodge, his weathered hands folded as he spoke in measured tones. The tribal council had made a decision that surprised everyone, including Sarah herself. She would be given in marriage to Thomas Lone Wolf, a man who lived at the furthest edge of their territory. Beyond the pine ridges where few ventured, Sarah's grandmother, old woman singing, clicked her tongue disapprovingly from her place by the fire. "That man has been alone too long," she muttered, stirring the morning soup with more force than necessary. "Living out there with just those two children, it isn't natural." The children grandmother mentioned were twins, barely 5 years old, who had come to Thomas under mysterious circumstances 2 winters ago. No one in the tribe knew their full story. Some said their mother had died in childbirth. Others whispered that Thomas had found them abandoned during a harsh winter storm. The truth remained locked away with Thomas himself, who rarely spoke when he came to the trading posts. Sarah's mother, gentle as morning rain, reached over to touch her daughter's hand. "You don't have to accept this arrangement," she said softly. "The council suggests, but the choice is yours." But Sarah had been raised to understand duty and community. The Modoc people had survived countless hardships by supporting one another, by making sacrifices for the greater good. If the council believed this marriage would serve some purpose, she would not be the one to question their wisdom. Still, questions burned in her mind like embers. Why her? Why now? Why had Thomas Lone Wolf, who had refused all previous offers of companionship from tribal families, suddenly agreed to take a wife? And what was so special about those twins that the entire arrangement seemed to center around their care? Chief Running Bear seemed to read her thoughts. "Thomas came to us 3 days ago," he explained. "He said the children need a mother's influence. The boy Little Fox has grown wild without proper guidance. The girl, Singing Bird, barely speaks above a whisper. They need stability, traditions, the kind of nurturing only a woman can provide." Sarah nodded, though something in the chief's tone suggested there was more to the story. She had seen Thomas Lone Wolf only a handful of times during tribal gatherings. He was tall and lean, with prematurely gray streaks in his black hair despite being only in his late 20s. His eyes held a sadness that seemed deeper than ordinary grief, and he carried himself like a man bearing invisible burdens. The other young women of the tribe found him intriguing, but unapproachable. He would arrive at gatherings alone, conduct whatever business brought him to the main village, and disappear again into the wilderness before the evening fires were lit. Some of the elders remembered him as a different person years ago, laughing, social, eager to participate in hunts and ceremonies. Old Woman Singing set down her stirring stick with a sharp crack. "Mark my words, child," she said, fixing Sarah with her knowing gaze. "That man carries secrets like a winter storm carries ice. Some secrets are meant to stay buried." But Sarah felt something stirring in her heart that surprised her. Not fear, but curiosity mixed with compassion. Perhaps Thomas Lone Wolf and his mysterious twins needed exactly what she could offer. Perhaps this strange arrangement was not a burden, but an opportunity to build something meaningful from broken pieces. As the sun climbed higher and burned away the morning mist, Sarah made her decision. She would accept the proposal. She would travel to the remote cabin where Thomas lived with the twins. She would become a mother to children who weren't born to her, and a wife to a man whose past remained shrouded in mystery. What she didn't know was that her decision would uncover a truth so shocking that it would shake the very foundations of everything the Modoc tribe believed about family, loyalty, and the lengths one person would go to protect the innocent. The secret Thomas Lone Wolf carried was not just about the twins' origins. It was about a promise made in blood, a deception maintained for love, and a sacrifice that would redefine what it meant to be family. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself on horseback, following a winding trail through dense forest that few had traveled. Her belongings were packed in leather bundles behind her saddle, clothing, medicines, beading supplies, and the precious family recipes her mother had written on strips of bark. The journey to Thomas Lone Wolf's cabin would take 2 days. With an overnight stop at Running Creek, her escort was her cousin Marcus Strongbow, a reliable man who had volunteered for the duty despite his obvious concerns about the arrangement. As their horses picked their way along the narrow mountain path, Marcus kept glancing at Sarah as if expecting her to change her mind and turn back. "You can still reconsider," he said for the 3rd time that morning. "No one would think less of you. This Thomas, he's not like other men, living alone out there for so long, raising those strange children." Sarah adjusted her grip on the reins and kept her eyes on the trail ahead. "What makes the children strange, Marcus? Have you ever actually spoken with them?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Well, no, but everyone talks. The boy, Little Fox, they say he has episodes where he screams in his sleep. And the girl, Singing Bird, she draws pictures of things no child should know about. Dark things, violence." These were new details Sarah hadn't heard before, and they sent a chill through her despite the warm afternoon sun. "What kind of pictures?" "My wife's sister saw them once when Thomas brought supplies to the trading post. The girl had drawn scenes of fire and running people, men with guns chasing families through the forest. She's only 5 years old, Sarah. Where would a child that age learn such things unless she had seen them?" The implications hung heavy in the mountain air. Sarah began to form theories in her mind, each more disturbing than the last. Perhaps the twins weren't orphans in the traditional sense. Perhaps they were survivors of something terrible, a raid, a massacre, some tragedy that had left them traumatized and alone. As the day wore on, the forest grew thicker and more isolated. They passed abandoned hunting camps and old burial grounds marked with weathered totems. This was ancient land, where the old spirit still moved freely and the boundary between the living world and the spirit world grew thin. Just before sunset, they reached Running Creek, where they would make camp for the night. As Marcus gathered wood for their fire, Sarah walked to the water's edge to fill their drinking pouches. The creek ran clear and cold, carrying the mountain's pure essence down to the valleys below. It was there in the growing twilight that she saw the first sign that they were entering Thomas Lone Wolf's territory. Carved into a large pine tree near the water was a symbol unlike any traditional Modoc marking she recognized. It looked like a wolf's paw print, but with additional lines and curves that seemed to tell a story in a language she couldn't read. Below it, scratched more recently into the bark, were 2 smaller symbols, what appeared to be a fox and a bird. Marcus joined her by the tree, following her gaze to the mysterious markings. His expression grew troubled. "Trail markers," he said quietly. "But not our trail markers. Whose then? I don't know. But Sarah, look at this." He pointed to scratches in the dirt near the tree's base. "These are recent. Within the last few days, someone has been watching this path." That night, as they sat by their campfire sharing dried meat and corn cakes, Marcus told Sarah stories he had heard from other hunters who had ventured into the remote regions where Thomas lived. Tales of strange sounds in the night. Not animal sounds, but human voices speaking in languages that didn't belong to any known tribe. Reports of camps that appeared and disappeared like mirages, sightings of people who moved through the forest like ghosts. There one moment and gone the next. "Some say Thomas isn't just caring for those twins," Marcus said, his voice low and serious. "Some say he's hiding them, protecting them from people who want them back." Sarah pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Protected from whom?" "That's what no one knows. But think about it, Sarah. A man doesn't isolate himself and 2 small children in the wilderness unless he's running from something, and he doesn't suddenly decide he needs a wife unless that something is getting closer." Sleep came fitfully that night. Sarah dreamed of children's voices calling out in the darkness, of shadowy figures moving between the trees, of secrets buried so deep they had taken root and grown into something alive and dangerous. When morning came, they broke camp early and continued toward Thomas's cabin. With each mile, the forest seemed to grow quieter, as if the very animals sensed something was different in this part of the wilderness. By afternoon, they could smell wood smoke in the distance, a sign that they were approaching their destination. Sarah's heart began to beat faster, not just with anticipation, but with the growing certainty that she was riding toward something far more complex and dangerous than a simple marriage arrangement. Whatever truth Thomas Lone Wolf was hiding, whatever secret had driven him to seek a wife for himself and a mother for his mysterious twins, she was about to become part of it. The question that haunted her as they drew closer to the cabin was whether she was riding toward salvation or disaster, and whether the truth, when it finally emerged, would be something she could live with, or something that would destroy everything she thought she knew about trust, family, and the lengths people would go to protect the ones they loved. The cabin appeared through the trees like something from a dream, larger than Sarah had expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney from which smoke rose in a steady, welcoming column. A well-tended garden stretched along one side, filled with corn, beans, and squash growing in traditional three-sister formation. Children's toys were scattered in the yard, carved wooden animals, a small bow with blunt arrows, dolls made from corn husks and scraps of cloth. Thomas Lone Wolf emerged from the cabin as they approached, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The years of solitude had changed him in ways that made him seem both older and more vital than she remembered. His shoulders were broader from constant physical work, his hands calloused from building and maintaining this isolated homestead. But his eyes still carried that deep sadness she had noticed at tribal gatherings, along with something new, a wariness that spoke of constant vigilance. Behind him came the twins, and Sarah immediately understood why the tribal gossips had called them strange. Little Fox, despite being only 5, moved with the careful alertness of someone much older, his dark eyes constantly scanning the tree line as if expecting danger. Singing Bird clung to her brother's hand, her small face pale and serious beyond her years. Both children were clean and well-fed, but there was something in their posture, their expressions, that spoke of experiences no child should have. "Sarah Morningstar," Thomas said, his voice formal but not unkind. "You honor my home with your presence." Marcus Strongbow dismounted and helped Sarah down from her horse. "The tribal council sends their blessing on this union," he said, performing the traditional words. "May it bring strength to both families and children to carry on the bloodline." Little Fox whispered something urgently in his sister's ear, and Singing Bird's grip on his hand tightened. Thomas noticed the exchange and knelt beside the children, speaking to them in low, reassuring tones. Sarah caught only fragments of what he said, but his tone was infinitely gentle. Not the voice of a man keeping secrets, but of someone who had learned to comfort frightened children. After Marcus departed with promises to return in one moon to check on the new family, Sarah found herself alone with her new husband and his mysterious wards. The cabin was comfortable inside, furnished with handmade tables and chairs, colorful blankets and shelves lined with books, more books than she had ever seen in one place. "You read?" she asked Thomas, running her fingers along the leather spines. "Some," he replied. "The children enjoy stories. Little Fox especially likes adventures tales, and Singing Bird prefers books about animals and faraway places." It was then that Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip. Mixed in with the English books were volumes in other languages, Spanish, French, and what looked like German. But more intriguing were several handwritten journals bound in different types of leather, as if they had been acquired at different times and places. Little Fox approached her cautiously, carrying one of his carved wooden animals, a wolf that had been painted with remarkable detail. "Thomas made this for me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He makes everything we need." Sarah knelt to Little Fox's level, studying the carved wolf. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, but what struck her most was the design painted on its side, the same mysterious symbol she had seen carved into the tree at Running Creek. "This is beautiful," she said honestly. "What does this marking mean?" The boy's eyes darted quickly to Thomas, then back to Sarah. "It means family," he said simply. "Thomas says the wolf takes care of his pack no matter what." That evening, as they shared a simple meal of venison stew and cornbread, Sarah began to piece together small clues about the household she had joined. The children spoke English perfectly, but occasionally used words that seemed to come from other languages. They ate with careful manners that suggested formal training, not the casual style common among tribal children. Most tellingly, they both startled at sudden noises and instinctively looked to Thomas for reassurance before relaxing. Singing Bird, despite her supposed reluctance to speak, eventually warmed enough to show Sarah some of her drawings. The pictures Marcus had described as dark and violent were certainly present, but Sarah saw them differently than the gossips had. These weren't the random scribbles of a disturbed child. They were detailed, almost photographic representations of specific events. A house burning while people ran toward a forest. Men on horseback chasing a wagon. A woman hiding children under a bridge while uniformed soldiers searched nearby. These are very good pictures, Sarah said carefully. Did you see these things happen? Singing Bird nodded solemnly. Before Thomas found us, bad men came to our house. Mama told us to run and hide, but we saw everything from the woods. Thomas appeared at Sarah's shoulder so quietly she hadn't heard him approach. His face was tense as he looked at his daughter's artwork. Singing Bird, why don't you help me prepare your brother's bed? Sarah will want to rest after her long journey. As the little girl gathered her drawings, Thomas caught Sarah's eye. We need to talk, he said quietly. Tonight, after the children sleep, there are things you need to understand if you're going to stay here. Things that will help you decide if this arrangement can work. The gravity in his tone sent chills through Sarah's body. She realized that her marriage to Thomas Lone Wolf was not the beginning of a new life, but her entrance into an existing drama that had been playing out in secret for years. Later that night, as she lay on her new bed listening to the sounds of the forest outside, Sarah heard Little Fox cry out in his sleep. Not the normal sounds of childhood nightmares, but words in a language she didn't recognize, spoken with the terror of someone reliving actual trauma. Through the thin cabin walls, she could hear Thomas moving quietly to comfort the boy, his voice murmuring the same foreign words in soothing tones. Whatever had happened to these children before Thomas found them, whatever secrets he was keeping to protect them, Sarah was now part of it whether she understood it or not. Tomorrow, he had promised he would tell her the truth. The question that kept her awake was whether that truth would be something she could accept, or something that would force her to choose between her own safety and the welfare of two innocent children who had already lost everything once. The next morning dawned gray and cold with thick clouds promising rain before nightfall. Sarah woke to the sound of Thomas chopping wood, outside and the quiet voices of the twins, playing some elaborate game involving their carved animals and a complex arrangement of stones and sticks. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to find Little Fox and Singing Bird engaged in what appeared to be a reenactment of a journey. Their wooden figures moved carefully along paths marked by twigs, stopping at certain stones that seemed to represent important landmarks. We're playing the escape game, Little Fox explained when he noticed Sarah watching. The wolf family has to get to the safe place before the bad men find them. Singing Bird added her wooden bird to the arrangement. The bird scouts ahead to make sure the path is clear. Thomas taught us this game so we would know what to do if we ever had to run again. The casual way the children spoke about escape plans and running from danger made Sarah's stomach clench. These were not normal childhood games. These were survival exercises disguised as play, taught by someone who understood that danger was always a possibility. Thomas appeared from behind the cabin, his arms full of split logs. Sarah, would you walk with me after breakfast? I promised you explanations, and the time has come. They ate in relative silence, eggs from Thomas's small flock of chickens, bread baked in a Dutch oven, and coffee made from beans that must have cost a fortune to obtain in this remote location. The twins chattered quietly between themselves, but Sarah noticed they kept glancing at Thomas as if reading his mood and adjusting their behavior accordingly. After the meal, Thomas led Sarah along a narrow path that wound through the forest behind the cabin. They walked in silence for nearly a mile, before reaching a small clearing where someone had built a circle of stones around a carefully maintained fire pit. The remains of old campfires suggested this place had been used many times. This is where I come to think, Thomas said, settling onto a fallen log that served as a natural bench, and where I come to remember. Sarah sat beside him, close enough to offer comfort but far enough to give him space. Tell me about the children, Thomas. Tell me the truth. He was quiet for so long that Sarah began to wonder if he had changed his mind. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of carefully guarded secrets. Their names aren't Little Fox and Singing Bird, he began. Those are the names I gave them when they came to live with me. Their real names are Friedrich and Greta Zimmermann. They're German immigrants and they're not orphans in the way people understand orphans. Sarah felt the world shift beneath her. German, but they speak English perfectly and they know our customs. Because I taught them. Because their survival depended on it. Thomas picked up a small stone and rolled it between his palms. 2 years ago, I was hunting in the far territories when I came across smoke rising from what I thought was a campfire. Instead, I found a burning homestead and 3 bodies, A man, a woman, and an older boy, maybe 12 years old. The horror in his voice made Sarah's breath catch. The children's family? Heinrich Zimmermann, his wife Anna, and their eldest son Johann. They had been shot by men who took everything of value and burned the rest. I found Friedrich and Greta hiding in a root cellar, terrified and covered in soot, speaking only German and crying for their mother. Thomas stood abruptly and walked to the edge of the clearing, his back to Sarah as he continued. The men who killed their family weren't random bandits. They were wearing pieces of army uniforms, and they had left behind papers that showed they were specifically hunting German families who had settled in this region. Something about the war, about suspicion of foreign influences. Sarah felt sick. She had heard whispers of such things. Federal agents and local militias targeting immigrant communities during times of tension, families disappearing in the night, properties seized under various pretexts. But she had never imagined it reaching their remote territories. You could have taken them to the authorities, she said quietly. Thomas turned back to her, his eyes blazing with barely controlled anger. What authorities? The same government that sent those men? The same system that decided German immigrants were enemies to be eliminated? Those children would have been sent to institutions or worse. They had already lost everything once. I couldn't let it happen again. So you kept them. I saved them, he corrected firmly. I gave them new identities, new stories, new language skills. I taught them to blend in, to survive. Heinrich Zimmermann had been an educated man. His children could already read and write in German. It wasn't difficult to teach them English and our customs. The pieces began falling into place in Sarah's mind. The books in your cabin, the different languages. You've been educating them beyond what most tribal children learn. Friedrich, little fox, has his father's mind for learning. He speaks 4 languages now and can solve mathematics problems that would challenge grown men. Greta, singing bird, has her mother's artistic gift, but also a memory that captures every detail she sees. They're remarkable children, Sarah, but they're also living with trauma that most adults couldn't handle. Sarah stood and moved to stand beside Thomas. The nightmares, the drawings, the way they watch the tree line, they remember everything. Every detail of that night, every moment of terror. Some nights, Friedrich screams in German, calling for his real parents. Greta draws pictures not because she's disturbed, but because she's trying to process memories that won't leave her alone. The rain that had been threatening all morning finally began, light drops pattering on the leaves above them. Thomas moved to shelter Sarah under a large pine tree, his movements automatic and protective. Why are you telling me this now? Sarah asked. Why did you suddenly decide you needed a wife? Thomas's expression grew grim. Because they've been found. The men who killed the Zimmermann family or others like them. 3 weeks ago, I discovered fresh camps in the area. Professional camps made by people who know how to hide their presence. Someone has been watching us, studying our routines. Fear shot through Sarah like lightning. How do you know? Little signs. Broken branches where no animal would break them. Footprints in mud that don't match any local hunters. Most telling, someone left a message carved into a tree near our water source. A German word. Gefunden. It means found. Sarah felt her knees grow weak. So the marriage was my desperate attempt to create legitimacy for our family. If investigators come, if questions are asked, having a tribal wife makes our household appear normal and legal. You provide cover for the children and protection for the secret we're keeping. The full weight of what she had walked into crashed over Sarah like a cold wave. She wasn't just a wife and stepmother. She was an accomplice in hiding fugitive children, a guardian of secrets that could get them all killed, and now a target for whoever was hunting the last surviving members of the Zimmermann family. But as she looked at Thomas, standing in the rain with water streaming down his face and desperation in his eyes, Sarah realized something that surprised her. She wasn't angry about being deceived. She wasn't afraid of the danger. Instead, she felt a fierce protective instinct rising in her chest. For little Fox with his brilliant mind and nightmare-filled sleep. For Singing Bird with her artistic soul and traumatic memories, and for Thomas himself, who had risked everything to save 2 innocent children. What do we do now? She asked. The relief in Thomas's face was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. We prepare. We make plans. And we pray that love and determination are stronger than whoever is hunting our children. The next 3 weeks passed in careful preparation and growing tension. Sarah threw herself into learning everything she could about the children's real history, while helping Thomas strengthen their defenses against whatever threat was approaching. During the day, life maintained an appearance of normalcy. Sarah taught Singing Bird traditional beadwork and cooking skills, while Little Fox helped Thomas with repairs around the property. But beneath the surface, every activity had a double purpose. The beadwork sessions were also lessons in identifying different types of men's clothing from a distance, the difference between a hunter's leather and a soldier's wool uniform. The cooking lessons included instruction on preparing food that could travel quickly without spoiling. Little Fox's work with Thomas involved not just cabin maintenance, but memorizing every path, hiding place, and escape route within a 5-mile radius. In the evenings, Sarah learned the full scope of Thomas's protective measures. Hidden throughout the forest were emergency supply caches, buried containers holding food, weapons, warm clothing, and money. He had established contact points with sympathetic traders who could provide fresh horses or boats if a quick escape became necessary. Most impressively, he had spent 2 years creating false identities not just for the children, but for their entire fabricated family history. If anyone investigates, he explained while showing Sarah a collection of forged documents, they will find records of Little Fox and Singing Bird being born to a Modoc woman who died in childbirth. I've paid people in 3 different towns to remember the story and corroborate the details. Sarah studied the papers with amazement, birth certificates, baptismal records, even a detailed family tree that connected the children to legitimate tribal bloodlines. How did you learn to do all this? Thomas's smile was sad. Before I came to live among the Modoc, I had different skills. I worked for people who valued discretion and the ability to create new identities when old ones became dangerous. It was another mystery added to the growing collection surrounding her husband. Sarah was beginning to understand that Thomas Lone Wolf himself might not be the name he was born with, and his past probably contained as many secrets as the children's present. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning when Little Fox burst into the cabin, his face white with terror. "Thomas, Sarah, there are strange men by the creek. 3 of them, and they're looking at our trail markers." Thomas was on his feet instantly, moving with the fluid speed of someone who had rehearsed this moment countless times. "Sarah, get the travel packs from under our bed." "Friedrich, where exactly did you see them?" "By the big rock where we carved the wolf sign." They were copying the marks onto paper and talking in quiet voices. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled out the emergency bundles Thomas had prepared. Each contained enough supplies for several days of travel, plus weapons and the precious forged documents that could save their lives. "Greta," Thomas called, and Singing Bird appeared from the back room where she had been drawing. "Remember the game we practiced? The one where the wolf family has to disappear?" The little girl nodded solemnly. At 5 years old, she understood that this was not a game, but she also understood that her survival depended on following the rules they had taught her. Thomas moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, gathering specific items while issuing quiet instructions. "Sarah, can you handle a rifle?" "Yes." "Good, take the Winchester and 2 boxes of ammunition." "Friedrich, get your sister's warm coat and your own travel moccasins. We leave in 10 minutes. But as they prepared to abandon the home they had built together, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the forest. Too late for the planned escape to the northern trails. Too late for anything but the most desperate backup plan. "The root cellar," Thomas ordered. "Now." They had drilled this scenario as well. Behind the cabin was a storm cellar designed to look abandoned and unused, but actually equipped with enough supplies to hide a family for days if necessary. As they scrambled toward the hidden entrance, Sarah caught a glimpse of the approaching riders through the trees. 5 men in dark clothing, moving with military precision. The leader was a tall, thin man with a scarred face and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Even from a distance, Sarah could see he was studying the ground, reading the signs of their hasty preparations. They tumbled into the cellar just as the riders reached the cabin yard. Through a carefully concealed ventilation gap, they could hear voices and the sound of boots on the wooden porch. "The fire's still warm," one man called out. "They were here minutes ago." "Search everything," came the reply in an accent Sarah didn't recognize. Not quite German, but something similar. "Look for signs of the children. Any indication they were here." Singing Bird was trembling against Sarah's side, while Little Fox pressed his face against Thomas's chest. Sarah could feel the tension radiating from her husband as they listened to their home being methodically destroyed above their heads. "Captain," another voice reported, "I found children's clothes in the back room and toys. Handmade, but definitely child-sized. Ages, 5 or 6, I'd estimate. The right age for the Zimmerman survivors." Sarah felt Little Fox stiffen at the sound of his original family name. Thomas's arm tightened around the boy's shoulders in silent comfort and warning. The search continued for what felt like hours. The men were thorough, professional, and clearly experienced in tracking fugitives. They examined everything: the garden for signs of recent harvesting, the chicken coop for evidence of daily care, even the fireplace ashes for clues about recent meals. "Sir," came yet another voice, this one younger and less confident. "What if they've already run? What if we're too late?" "We're not too late, soldier. Thomas Lone Wolf has been protecting those children for 2 years. He won't abandon them now, and he won't travel far with a woman and 2 small children. They're hiding nearby, waiting for us to leave." The leader's voice was cold and certain, and it sent chills through Sarah's entire body. This was not a random search. These men knew exactly who they were hunting and why. "Set up a perimeter camp," the captain ordered. "We wait. They'll have to come back for supplies eventually, or they'll try to retrieve something they left behind. Either way, we'll be ready." As afternoon faded into evening, the reality of their situation became clear. The men weren't leaving. They were settling in for a siege, confident that hunger, thirst, or desperation would eventually drive their quarry into the open. In the cramped darkness of the root cellar, Sarah held the 2 children while Thomas kept watch through their concealed opening. The temperature was dropping with the setting sun, and their emergency supplies wouldn't last more than a few days. "What do they want with the children?" Sarah whispered so quietly that only Thomas could hear. His answer was barely a breath against her ear. Heinrich Zimmerman wasn't just a farmer. He was a courier, carrying information between German communities and sympathizers back in Europe. "When they killed him, they didn't find what they were looking for. They think the children know where it's hidden, do they?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Friedrich remembers everything his father taught him, including the location of something that could change the course of the war if it falls into the wrong hands. Sarah closed her eyes, finally understanding the full scope of what they were facing. They weren't just protecting 2 orphaned children. They were guarding secrets that could affect national security, hidden in the memory of a 5-year-old boy who still cried for his murdered parents. Above them, the enemy was settling in for the night, confident in their eventual victory. But Thomas Lone Wolf had spent 2 years preparing for this moment, and Sarah was beginning to discover that her new husband had resources and skills that went far beyond anything the tribal gossips had ever imagined. The second night in the root cellar was when Thomas revealed the final piece of his true identity. As the children slept fitfully against Sarah's shoulders, he moved to the farthest corner of their hiding place and began removing stones from what had appeared to be a solid wall. Behind the stones was a hidden compartment containing items Sarah had never expected to see in their remote wilderness home: military maps marked with coded symbols, telegraph equipment wrapped in oiled cloth, weapons that were far more sophisticated than hunting rifles, and most shocking of all, official papers bearing the seal of the United States War Department. "Thomas," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who are you really?" He handed her a leather document case, his movements careful and deliberate. "My name is Thomas Whitehorse. I'm a federal agent assigned to protect German immigrants who provide intelligence to our government. Heinrich Zimmerman was one of my contacts." Sarah's world tilted again as she tried to process this revelation. "You're not Modoc?" "My mother was Modoc. My father was a cavalry officer. I grew up between 2 worlds, which made me useful to people who needed someone who could move freely, in both white and tribal communities." The papers in the case confirmed his story. Official assignments, coded communications, and correspondence with military intelligence officers who had been tracking German spy networks throughout the Western territories. "The men above us aren't just hunting the children for revenge," Thomas continued. "They're foreign agents probably working for German intelligence. Heinrich Zimmerman had discovered the location of a major sabotage operation planned against railroad bridges and military supply depots. The information is hidden in a code that only Friedrich knows how to decipher." Sarah looked at the sleeping boy, so small and innocent in the dim light. "He's just a child. How could he know such things? His father taught him numbers and patterns as games. What Friedrich thinks are mathematical puzzles are actually encoding keys for military intelligence. Heinrich planned to extract the information gradually, but he was killed before he could complete the process. Above them, footsteps moved across the cabin floor. The enemy was still searching, still waiting. Sarah could hear them talking in low voices, discussing search patterns and guard rotations with military precision. Thomas began assembling his telegraph equipment with practiced speed. I'm going to try to contact my handler in Sacramento. If I can get word out about our situation, help might come. But it will take time, and how much time? 3 days minimum, maybe 5. Sarah calculated their remaining supplies against the timeline. They could survive, but barely. The children would suffer, and little Fox's cough was already getting worse in the damp underground air. As Thomas worked on his telegraph message, tapping out code in careful, quiet bursts, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She moved to where the weapons were stored and selected a small pistol that felt comfortable in her hand. "What are you planning?" Thomas asked, pausing in his telegraph work. "I'm going to create a distraction. If I can draw some of them away from the cabin, you might be able to get the children to one of your supply caches in the forest." Thomas shook his head immediately. Too dangerous. These aren't ordinary soldiers or even federal agents. They're professionals who have killed entire families without hesitation. Then we need to be more professional than they are. Sarah began studying the maps Thomas had hidden, memorizing the locations of his emergency supplies and escape routes. She had grown up hunting with her father and brothers. She knew these forests as well as anyone alive. If she could use that knowledge cleverly, she might be able to turn their enemies' confidence against them. "There's something else," Thomas said reluctantly. "Something I haven't told you about why they're so determined to catch Friedrich." Sarah waited, sensing that this final revelation would be the most dangerous of all. The sabotage operation Heinrich discovered isn't just about railroad bridges. They're planning to destroy a major military arsenal that contains experimental weapons. If they succeed, it could tip the balance of power in ways that affect the entire war. And Friedrich knows where this arsenal is located? Not directly, but he knows the code that will lead them to detailed maps of every military installation on the West Coast. His father was more than just a courier, Sarah. He was one of our most valuable intelligence assets. The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a lead blanket. They weren't just protecting 2 orphaned children or hiding from dangerous men. They were guarding information that could determine whether America won or lost a war that was spreading across the globe. But as she looked at Little Fox and Singing Bird, sleeping peacefully despite their terrible circumstances, Sarah knew that none of the larger implications mattered as much as keeping these 2 innocent children safe. Whatever Heinrich Zimmermann had discovered, whatever codes were locked in his son's memory, whatever consequences their escape or capture might have for national security, none of it was more important than the simple fact that these children had already lost one family to violence and deserved a chance to grow up in peace. Thomas finished his telegraph message and began carefully dismantling the equipment. "Help is coming," he said quietly, "but we have to survive until it arrives." Outside, dawn was beginning to break, and with it came the sound of increased activity from their hunters. The men were preparing for a more systematic search of the surrounding forest. Soon they would find the root cellar, and when they did, the game of hide-and-seek would become a fight for survival. Sarah checked her pistol and made sure she understood how to use Thomas's other weapons. Little Fox stirred against her shoulder, mumbling something in German that sounded like a child's prayer. Singing Bird clutched her wooden bird carving. The symbol Thomas had taught them meant safety and home. "Whatever happens," Sarah whispered to Thomas, "we protect them first. Everything else comes second." He nodded, and in his eyes she saw the same fierce determination that had driven him to save the children in the first place. They were no longer just playing the role of husband and wife. They had become something stronger, partners united by purpose and bound by their willingness to sacrifice everything for the innocent lives in their care. The hunt was about to begin in earnest, but the hunters didn't realize they were no longer chasing helpless refugees. They were facing a federal agent with years of experience, a tribal woman who knew every secret of the wilderness, and 2 children whose survival had already proven that sometimes love and determination really were stronger than violence and greed. The final confrontation came not with the systematic search Sarah had expected, but with a stroke of luck that nearly turned into disaster. On the third morning, while the enemy agents were conducting their grid pattern sweep of the forest, Little Fox began having one of his coughing fits, the kind that had been getting worse in the damp underground air. Despite Thomas's hand over the boy's mouth and Sarah's desperate attempts to muffle the sound, the coughing echoed through the root cellar's ventilation system. Above them, footsteps stopped abruptly. "Did you hear that?" came a voice in accented English. "Could be an animal," another replied, but without conviction. Sarah and Thomas exchanged glances in the dim light. Their hiding place had been compromised. The game was over. Thomas moved with lightning speed, gathering the children and pressing his lips close to Little Fox's ear. "Remember the wolf song I taught you?" he whispered in the mixture of English and German they used for their most important communications. "Sing it in your head and stay brave. Your papa would be proud." Little Fox nodded, his small face set with determination that broke Sarah's heart. Singing Bird clutched her wooden bird and reached for Sarah's hand. Above them, the voices were organizing a careful excavation of the area around the concealed entrance. These men knew what they were looking for now, and they had the patience and tools to find it. Thomas handed Sarah one of his military-grade pistols and positioned himself near the hidden entrance with a rifle. "When they break through," he said quietly, "I'll try to draw their attention. You get the children to the emergency exit and head for cache point 7. Remember the landmarks I showed you on the maps?" Sarah nodded, though her heart was pounding so hard she could barely think. She had memorized the escape routes, but knowing them intellectually and executing them while protecting two terrified children were entirely different challenges. The sound of digging grew closer. Metal tools scraped against wood and stone as the enemy worked to uncover their refuge. Then suddenly the digging stopped. "Agent Whitehorse," called the scarred captain's voice from directly above their heads. "I know you can hear me. I have a proposition for you." Thomas said nothing, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders as he aimed his rifle at the concealed entrance. "We don't want the woman or the boy," the captain continued. "We only need Friedrich Zimmermann and the information his father taught him. Give us the child and we'll let the rest of you walk away." Little Fox's grip on Sarah's hand tightened. Even at 5 years old, he understood exactly what was being offered and what it meant for his future. His father was a traitor who sold secrets to your government. The voice above continued. "The boy carries knowledge that belongs to the German Empire. We're simply reclaiming stolen property." Sarah felt a surge of rage at hearing Little Fox described as property. She looked at Thomas, expecting to see him calculating odds and considering the terrible bargain being offered. Instead, his face showed only cold determination. "Counteroffer," Thomas called back, his voice carrying clearly through the cellar ceiling. "You and your men leave now, and I won't kill all of you." The response was immediate laughter from multiple voices. "Agent Whitehorse, you're trapped underground with limited ammunition and no backup. We have time, supplies, and superior numbers. Be reasonable." "Here's reasonable," Thomas replied, and then he triggered a mechanism Sarah hadn't known existed. Hidden throughout the forest around their cabin were small explosive charges connected to tripwires. Not enough to kill, but sufficient to create chaos and confusion. As Thomas activated them in sequence, the sound of small explosions began popping throughout the woods like strings of firecrackers. The enemy agents above began shouting orders and running toward the sounds, convinced they were under attack by a larger force. In the confusion, Thomas pushed open the emergency exit that led to a concealed tunnel extending 50 yards from the cellar. "Now," he whispered urgently. They crawled through the narrow passage in single file, Thomas first, then the children, with Sarah bringing up the rear. The tunnel was dark and cramped, barely wide enough for an adult, but it had been expertly constructed with proper ventilation and reinforced walls. They emerged in a thick stand of pine trees nearly a quarter mile from the cabin. Behind them, they could hear the enemy agents regrouping and shouting orders as they realized they had been outmaneuvered. Thomas led them along paths that were invisible to Sarah's eyes but clearly familiar to him. They moved quickly but quietly, with Little Fox and Singing Bird following instructions they had obviously practiced many times. Within an hour, they reached Cache Point 7, a hollow tree that contained food, water, weapons, and fresh clothing. But as they prepared to continue their escape toward the rendezvous point where Thomas hoped to meet his federal backup, the sound of approaching horses made them freeze. 5 riders were coming up the trail they had just traveled, moving too fast to be the enemy agents who had been searching on foot. As they drew closer, Sarah could see these were different men. Americans in frontier clothing riding with the easy confidence of people who belonged in this wilderness. Thomas stepped into the open with his hands raised but ready to draw his weapon. "Identify yourselves!" The lead rider, a grizzled man with a cavalry officer's bearing, reined in his horse 20 yards away. "Agent Whitehorse? I'm Colonel Morrison, Sacramento Intelligence. We got your telegraph message." The relief on Thomas's face was like watching a dam break. "Colonel, how many men do you have?" 12, counting myself. "And we brought some friends who know the local terrain." Morrison gestured, and from the forest around them emerged 6 tribal warriors, including Sarah's cousin, Marcus Strongbow. "Sarah," Marcus called, his face breaking into a grin of relief. "The whole tribe has been worried sick. When we got word that you were in danger, every warrior in the village volunteered to help." What followed was swift and decisive. The combined force of federal agents and tribal warriors surrounded the enemy agents at the cabin with overwhelming numbers and superior knowledge of the terrain. The foreign operatives, who had seemed so confident and professional while hunting a small family, found themselves completely outmatched when facing organized opposition. The capture was accomplished without a single shot being fired. The enemy captain, when faced with certain defeat, chose to surrender rather than die in a hopeless fight. As the prisoners were secured and prepared for transport to federal custody, Colonel Morrison approached Thomas with obvious respect. "Agent Whitehorse, your reports about the German spy network have been invaluable. Thanks to the information you protected, we've identified and neutralized sabotage cells in 3 states." Little Fox, who had been clinging to Sarah throughout the entire ordeal, looked up at Thomas with wide eyes. "Thomas," he said in careful English, "are the bad men gone forever now?" Thomas knelt beside the boy and pulled both children into a protective embrace. "Yes, Friedrich. The bad men are gone. You're safe now. Both of you are safe." Singing Bird, who had barely spoken above a whisper during their entire underground ordeal, suddenly found her voice. "Does this mean we can go home? To our real home with you and Sarah?" Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks as she realized what the little girl meant. Home wasn't the place they had fled from or the family they had lost. Home was the new family they had built together, a federal agent using an assumed name, a tribal woman who had married to help protect strangers, and 2 immigrant children whose survival had depended on learning to trust again. 3 months later, after all the official debriefings and paperwork were completed, Sarah stood in the yard of their rebuilt cabin, watching Thomas teach Little Fox to carve detailed figures, while Singing Bird drew pictures of their life. Not the dark memories of violence and loss, but bright scenes of their daily activities. Their garden, their evening meals together. The tribal council had officially adopted both children into the Modoc Nation, giving them legal protection and tribal citizenship that would shield them from any future questions about their origins. Little Fox had become a celebrity among the other children for his ability to solve complex mathematical problems, while Singing Bird's artistic talents were already being celebrated by the tribal elders. Thomas had been reassigned to a permanent posting that allowed him to remain in their territory, working as a liaison between federal authorities and tribal nations. His skills were still valuable to the government, but now he could use them while maintaining the family life that had become more important to him than any mission. As Sarah watched her husband and children in the golden evening light, she reflected on how strange and wonderful it was that deception had led to truth, secrets had created safety, and a marriage that began as a protective arrangement had become the foundation of genuine love. The Modoc people still talked about the story, though most of them never learned the complete truth. They spoke of how young Sarah Morningstar had married a mysterious man to help raise his orphan children, and how that act of compassion had saved not just 2 innocent lives, but had helped protect the entire nation from those who would do it harm. But Sarah knew the real story was simpler and more profound than any of the dramatic details. Sometimes, when the world becomes dark and dangerous, ordinary people make extraordinary choices. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply opening your heart to strangers and deciding that their safety matters more than your own security. And sometimes the most important secrets aren't the ones you keep from the world, but the ones you share with the people you choose to call family.